All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the first episode of the This.Labs podcast. My name is Rob Ocel. I'm an engineer at This.Labs. And along with me today, I have co-host Tracy Lee, who is our founder at This. I also have another one of our senior engineers, James Spivey. James, how are you doing?
Good, thank you.
And we also are joined by Jarrod Overson, who's a director at Shape Security. So, hi, Jarrod. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So for today's first episode, we decided to just jump right in to a big topic and talk about web performance. So web performance is something that means a lot of different things to different people. It is definitely being talked about on social media. It is something that comes up at all the conferences. So it's something that everybody's talking about. And here on the panel, I don't believe any of us here are experts, but we're here to talk about web performance from our perspective, what we've seen, and just sort of talk about it in a ways that people can start to break into the concept. So just to kind of open things up and get people talking, the first question is, what do you guys, when you heard the phrase web performance just now, what was the first thing that popped into your head? And Jarrod, why don't you get us started? Like, what is web performance? What's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Oh, the first thing that comes to my mind is try not to be annoyed. Try not to be annoyed. From my perspective, so I've come through lots of different companies. I'm at security now. I was at a video game company, Riot Games, before. And the most important thing, regardless of anything else, is the user experience. And a lot of times when we talk about performance, we are really trying to talk about the user experience, but we're not using the right words, we're not using the right terms, and we're not focusing on the right things. So we can do a lot of good things in performance that happen to end up benefiting the user experience. But if we focus on the user experience first and target performance and other things from there, then we end up adding a lot more value with a lot less effort.
Great. James, how about you? Like, when you hear web performance, when you're on Twitter and you see a tweet go by talking about web performance, what are some of the first things that pop into your head?
For me, it's time to paint. There's a lot of conversation these days about how fast to render a page and how to get it usable as quickly as possible. We're talking about all these new tools like Angular elements and things that help us paint the image quicker and use the application faster, and what that looks like. So that's sort of the first thing that pops in my head, is what that experience is when you're first loading the site to make it usable as quickly as possible.
Awesome. And Tracy, how about you? What do you think of when you think of web performance?
I think that it's everyone who does performance these days that we see, that we look up to on the internet when we think about performance works at Google, which, probably shouldn't exactly be the case, but that is currently the case. So my excitement for this year is to really find all the people working on performance and all these different things and really try to sort of, get the performance world to a point where it's not just, hey, I work at Google, so I'm at performance. Or maybe that's a good way to get hired by Google. Focus on performance, and then you will work at Google.
Hey, it could be. Maybe that's the trick. I think I agree with you guys. For me, web performance is something that I'm really interested in, but it is two worlds for me. I think on the one side, I think you see on social media, it's really used as a wedge. And I think sometimes when you see a conversation about web performance spring up online, your first instinct might be again, do we have to do this? But when it actually comes to working on it and working on teams, I feel like that concept is really exciting. It's really exciting when you have a website that's kind of janky and it's a bit slow even for your developers on their devices, and you're like, hey, what are ways that we could fix this? And then you fix it, and everybody gets super excited to see those incremental progressions. So to me, I think what's really interesting when I think of web performance and when I think of this conversation, the conversations we'll have, is I'm hoping we can find a way so that when people see it, they get that excitement hit, and a little bit more understanding and a little bit less that sort of feeling of dread that they're about to get into a shouting match. So, I think that's something that we want to kind of highlight here. And so, Jarrod, you kind of touched on this a little bit at the start, but, performance I think some people think performance is only bundle size or only time to paint. But it's a broader topic than that, right? Like, you know, when on the apps that you've worked with or the things that you're familiar with, like what are some of the ways, the other ways that performance comes in to applications that we have?
So one of the things that I remember a lot from the video game industry is how important sound and responsiveness is, regardless of anything that is happening and frame rate and whatever else. It's how much the user feels that their actions are causing a meaningful change in the application that's running. And what sucks about the web is that sound is looked at as just an abhorrent thing, and no website should ever make a sound unless you're on YouTube and you're expressly watching something or playing something. But sound in video games and even desktop applications is important because it allows an application to, without interrupting any of the visuals, give some feedback that something is happening or that you did actually press this button and I did recognize that you pressed it enough to make this sound, and then magic is happening. So on the web, we have to do different things in order to provide that feedback. Paul Lewis actually just posted a video, another Googler, just posted a video on YouTube a few weeks ago about different ways of providing that visual feedback, where it's not just allowing the page to continue doing its thing or continue animating, whatever else, or having a spinner. It's waiting up until the time where a user should reasonably expect something to have happened, and then giving an additional little burst of feedback, like taking a little bit longer or some sort of different spinnery thing or whatever else. Just something that allows the user to understand that the application has got this. It's not hanging. It's not waiting on something. It's gonna complete in a normal time, and it's entirely under control. So there's just little things that can be done, and unfortunately, the web is kind of hampered because we're all trying to squeeze out the performance to reduce the bundle size as much as possible, to increase the frame rate as much as possible, but it's the user experience that makes the most difference. And there are a bunch of different ways we can attack that, some of which would actually increase the bundle size or technically degrade performance, but ends up with a better user experience.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, the idea of like sound or haptic experience, which I guess is kind of an analog to it a little bit. I don't know why I perceive haptic feedback sometimes as a sound, but I mean, I guess sometimes on your phones it plays that way. But like the YouTube app recently, I mean, I don't know how recently, but when you watch a video, sometimes it will show a piece of haptic feedback when it pops up the like notify bell to say like, click here to be notified when updates go live. And as a user, it obviously immediately grabs my attention. So I guess kudos for that. But it also feels very jarring. I mean, it's interesting that kind of sound feedback or haptic feedback is really something that is jarring to web users, especially mobile web users. You'd think it wouldn't be because it's so common in apps, but does anybody else have any other ideas or unusual things about performance that people don't usually think of if they focus only on like bundle size or?
It's the big one that's been really interesting. I've seen a lot of discussion about it is ghosting. So like Facebook and Twitter and a lot of these, that they're putting these ghost elements in place, sort of that UI, UX style that looks like the content that's going to be loaded there, and it's that filler piece. I don't think enough people have been talking about it lately, and you still don't see it a lot in sort of enterprise, large scale projects, but you are seeing it a lot of these social media type things. And I think it's a really interesting way to tackle. It's not a bundle thing, as you know, you said, it could actually even increase size and complexity in a lot of cases, but it helps separate that jarring aspect we're talking about, where you can load a page, it sort of all feels right, it looks the way you expect it to look, and then all of a sudden the content just kind of gracefully appears. And I think that was one of those things that I would love to see more conversation about, more sort of standards around, and more libraries that really approach that problem, because there are unique challenges in trying to do something like that, especially when you're talking about dynamic content.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that reminds me a lot of there's a lot of conversation about jank. I mean, the term jank, if people aren't familiar with that, I actually don't know the technical definition of it, but the way that I understand the concept of jank is just when something doesn't behave as smoothly or as you would expect it if it didn't have a performance issue. So this could mean like a jerky animation, or you click something, it doesn't immediately respond. Those instances where something was being very fluid in your brain, but then it catches, that's jank. And one of the biggest examples of jank that I've encountered is with the client that I use for watching Twitter. When I get down to the bottom of the currently set of loaded tweets, and it loads in, the infinite scroll loads in the next set, it actually jumps me a few tweets down into that set. And so I have now this learned pattern of scrolling down the column, noticing when the jank load happens, then scrolling back up till I found the last tweet I remember reading, and then reading down from there. Now, as users, that's what you'll do. You'll learn to work around the behavior. But my goodness, how good I would feel the first day that bug is fixed and it just smoothly scrolls. So that has nothing to do with load time, nothing to do with bundle size, but like responsiveness, jank, doing what users expect when the app is actually running. Sometimes that is the hugest part of performance that people could look at and solve.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned that. Sorry, it just seems like we should have a term for when a user in the real world modifies their behavior to account for some crappy experience in an application.
I can tell you all these shopping websites that have weird, like there's this one website, I mean, this is a side note, but there's this one website, for example, it's Dillard, so you can filter. So it's like, okay, search in women's clothing. Okay, when you search in women's clothing, you can only filter by these things, right? But then you have to go back and back and back and start your first filter because it's like this tree thing versus allowing me to do it completely. But then, on a lot of shopping websites, right, you're just scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling and scrolling. And it's kind of the same thing that you're talking about, Rob, this jump from, okay, X to Y to Z, and then you kind of forget where you are. And that just, drives me absolutely up the wall. Speaking of shopping websites, also another thing is when they, you click into, so you're like, okay, I'm 400 things down. I've scrolled down all the way. And then all of a sudden you click into one item. And then when you press the back button, it takes you up to the top.
Oh, yeah.
Now that's not jank, but oh my God. Well, let's just have I can have an entire podcast just about crappy shopping websites.
Some of this feels like a conversation about infinite scrolling lists, right? Like that's one of those, it was one of those UI inventions that we've come up with, from the Facebook timeline type thing. And I think it's actually created a lot more problems than it solved. We talk about sort of the tweet monitors and Facebook, and I can't tell you times I've like scrolled Facebook, going down the timeline, and all of a sudden the whole thing just refreshes and I'm back at the top and I'm looking at something completely and utterly different. And I'm like, this was not where I was at. And that's the user experience that's degraded and, all in the name of like performance of infinite loading. Cause we want to get away from pagination or whatever it might be.
Yeah. Sam Ciccone, for example, it was funny because we were at this meetup and Sam had this, I don't remember what he was playing with. I think it was like something where, oh, that's right. It's where you could, he made this thing where you could draw, right? So it's kind of like a paint on his phone. And he was so excited because he's like, look how fast this goes. There's no joke. Do you see that? Just a paintbrush. And he was like so excited about it. But now you know what Googlers do. They just make like weird little web apps.
Yeah, once they've become web performance experts and then they join Google, then they get to play with the paintbrushes. So for everybody out there, that's what you have to look forward to. That's what you're working to. But I think this is interesting because I love this conversation because it really helps explain something about performance, which I think is lost, which is that performance to developers sometimes usually devolves into arguing whether a for loop or the .for each syntax is faster on 1 million iterations, right? But performance to your users is how efficiently and how does it spark joy for them to use your experience that you've crafted. Now, to them, load time is part of that, right? bundle size can be part of that. How much of their battery you consume while they're on your website is part of that. But sometimes it's how quickly, as Tracy was saying, you can filter to get to the content you want, pick the items you want, and do the thing you want. To them, that's performance, because it's how quickly, for them, they're measuring their performance by how quickly they get to a desired result. And one of the examples I had on a team that I was working with is we were building an app that was going to be used internally by a company. So it was a web app, but it was used internally. And what the use patterns of the users is they would often log on Monday and leave their computer running for the entire week. So realistically, how slow the app was to load up didn't really matter to those users at all. But what they would do is it needed to be very fast when it was performing actions, because these types of users were doing a rote task and they needed to do it as efficiently as possible, and they seldom made mistakes. So when we understood who the users were, we realized, hey, that means we need to do things like optimistic state uploading, right? So when they do an action, just assume it worked. Don't throw up a loading spinner waiting to commit it to the server. Just assume it worked and move on, because the next task is unrelated. And if it failed, give them a little notification that says, hey, the last thing you did didn't work. Do you want to go back and review it? And the team was like, oh my gosh, that's we didn't think about that. We were thinking about how to cut extra libraries out. And I think a big part of performance is knowing your users and knowing what they want to be fast.
Yeah, that's a really interesting subject. I've had this talk a bunch of times, and it becomes really compelling in large organizations. You see the guys from Narwhal talk about this and a bunch of other places, but optimistic updates versus pessimistic updates. How we handle that from a code perspective. A lot of places are moving towards that sort of, it's this optimistic update, and then we add the ability to sort of roll that back if things go wrong and display something to the user. But when do you do that? When do you apply that? Is there a time that that's not a preferred route and we really want to wait for the server, and spin? What happens if we do an optimistic update and they make several navigations and things fail? Do we take them back? Do we just show the message and say, hey, that last action, how do they have contextual awareness that that was what failed as opposed to something else they're doing? I mean, these are all really interesting performance challenges that I think we're only just starting to wrap our heads around from a sort of UX experience. So it's really intriguing as to what that looks like in 2019.
Definitely. And I realize we didn't necessarily introduce a term, but the concept of optimistic state updates is, Twitter has this, I think is always the canonical example, which in a lot of Twitter clients, if you like a tweet, it immediately shows you the feedback. The tweet appears liked, but it technically isn't liked on the server yet. Your client is still contacting the server. It's still saying, hey, the user tried to like it. But to the client, it's like, okay, well, if I told you liked it and then you scroll away, and in the end, the server had an error or your packets got lost and it didn't actually save. Okay, so you didn't like that tweet. It'll refresh the next time you see it. But do you care that you lost one like out of all the likes that you do on Twitter? So I think, James, exactly what you're saying, you have to know if it fits your use case, right? You have to have a lot of independent actions such that if you optimistically update the state, it doesn't change the concept of a future action. Because if that were true, then if some of those intermediate steps fail, you've really created a disjoint experience. Your user just their concept of reality goes out of sync. So you have to know when to use it and when not to use it. But again, that goes back to kind of just knowing what your users do.
Well, and some of that, I think, is really starting to change now that we're starting to see more things like Firebase out there, where you can sort of have an optimistic update, and then as it occurs, both your client, all the clients that you might use elsewhere, they're all automatically updated. You're seeing and reflecting these changes. It makes it a more relatively approachable type of problem. Like the thing I noticed with Twitter is, I use a client to like a tweet, as you talk about. If I like it there and then I, go onto Twitter, I see it. But if I like a tweet on Twitter and then go back to my client, I will only actually see my own tweet, like there. I can hit twice and it just, oh, actually you already liked this kind of thing. And so that real-time syncing between stuff makes optimistic updates, I think, much more approachable of a solution as opposed to much more cached solutions like REST.
Cool. So we've talked about a lot of the different types of performance, but it sounds like we're kind of putting down bundle size and load time, but we really aren't. Those are a really important part of performance. And for a large amount of sites on the internet, how quickly that site can come up and how much content they're trying to push down affects business metrics a lot. And I think, I'm curious if any of you have had experiences where you're talking to somebody and maybe they're taking the side of saying performance doesn't matter at all. Like, what are some of the things that we would say are reasons why people really should care about all types of performance, but, including load time and response time? What are some of the things that you would say to sort of convince your team or to convince your business that that's kind of something that's important, that's worth tracking?
The bundle size specifically? Sorry, I missed the...
Sure, bundle size. I mean, any performance. I mean, I think in this case, we want to pull the bundle size and the load times back in because I think those do matter. But how would you make the argument for caring about performance on teams that kind of feel like, maybe they want to poo-poo the whole thing?
I think also, Jarrod, you can speak very well to this because it's this whole idea as well as convincing business that it matters. How does it fit into the business objective?
So this is very, very hard and almost a daily part of my job because at Shape, we are deploying what amounts to a third-party bundle of JavaScript that does magical security things. And most people would say security is important, but as soon as that affects the experience in any way, everyone jumps up with their hair on fire saying, no, we can't have that. We want security, but with no cost whatsoever. And I mean, that would be great if it's possible. But I think what the deeper story is that when it comes to the user experience and the performance, many companies and many teams, they start out with an application and they just want to make it faster and faster and faster. They don't start necessarily with a performance budget, and then they bucket certain important aspects into what percentage of that budget that it can take up. So there'll be an application, then it's fast enough, and then they cram it full of ads or tracking stuff or other things. And then when later down the line, something really important comes up and it needs to be wedged in, it's not clear what it usurps because everything's important to the team. And they don't want to take anything out. They just want it to continually get faster or at the very least not get slower. And that's a very, very difficult conversation to have from a security point of view, because security in most companies and teams, generally it's the team that comes along and says, no, you can't do that, or no, that's wrong, or no, you're horrible, or change your passwords. So there's a lot of negativity around it. But if we choose the right spots on the gradient for user experience, performance, security, whatever else, we make a better experience overall that is more secure and just a more fun and nicer overall. But it's a discussion that is hard, and it's hard for an outside vendor like Shape to come in and start to have that discussion because teams generally feel like they're the experts of their domain, and coming in with a differing opinion is difficult. One of the things that I see in lots of companies, actually almost every single company, is how teams manage and track their performance just completely differently. There are teams that track time to first byte. There are bundle size, number of requests, time to DOM content ready, time to load, time to first user interaction. All these things are tracked in different ways, and it's very difficult to have the same type of conversation around because you have to attack the problem from a different user experience angle because everyone's just tracking what they think is most important, but it doesn't necessarily correlate to the experience in the way they think it does. Great.
I mean, there's two sites that I've used historically that I think are they'll blow your mind if you've never seen them before. And one of them is WPO Stats, Web Performance Optimization Stats, so WPOstats.com. And the other one is PWAstats.com, so Progressive Web Apps, PWAstats.com. And it's just lists of sort of quick hits, like little marketing blurbs from people that have published results of performance optimizations or moving to a PWA. And the returns will blow your mind. You'll think that it's fake, right? But it's real data. And I guess, Tracy, one question I have for you, because I know you talk to a lot of leaders of companies and things like that, is, is this the kind of stuff that they find convincing? Like, is this the kind of stuff that people should be using when they're trying to pitch this as something that their team should care about?
I mean, honestly, I feel like whenever it comes to anything, right, we look at testing. I feel like testing and performance are two of the things where it's really hard to convince the business to want to do, because everybody just wants features, features, features. And so performance is kind of like another one of those things, as how do you have the use case that, hey, this is saving X amount of hours, or this is bringing us X amount of revenue. We've all seen some of the larger sites. So when you look at some of the larger sites, you can be like, wow, I improved performance by, 10%. That made us $10 million. That sounds amazing. But for these smaller type companies, or even when you as a web developer who's maybe starting, or, working in a team of 2 to 3 or something like that, how do you actually do that? This is kind of the same thing with accessibility, right? Like, maybe I don't know if you guys can think of other ones, but performance, testing, accessibility are kind of those things where it's like, should we not? Should we spend money on it? And it's always put on the back burner.
Yeah, that actually brings up a really interesting one to me. Rob, you're talking about these PWA scores. The tool I think that's probably most obvious to this is Lighthouse. Google has created this amazing tool for testing and scoring your site. And what I find so intriguing about that tool is, from a business perspective, it makes it way easier to go and talk to a product manager, a product owner, a VP, the feature people, and go, listen, your scores are all in the red compared to the standard operating, advice of Google, and we really need to work on this, and this is why it's important. And they break it down really nicely as to where you're failing and where you can improve. Actionable items, actual real ways to improve these things. So it's not just, you suck, go fix it. It's, here, we think if you did this, this will be, really good for your site. And that has a lot of value. Tracy, you mentioned accessibility. One of my last companies, we focused a lot on accessibility, and part of that became from mistakes that were made early on, and some of the costs that come with operating in districts like California, areas in California where it's, it's a requirement. Having those good accessibility scores and the ability to show them has a lot of return, and more so, just, it's also the right thing to do. Ultimately, all of this that we're talking about is how to improve the experience for a customer. We want people to be able to use our sites. We want it to be user friendly, and we don't want to exclude people, like the accessibility stuff. We don't want to exclude the people that should be able to use it. If you have slow internet, if you've got accessibility needs, you should be able to use our site. And so that's what all of this ultimately is about. And I think that has a lot of value add to any company that embraces it and takes it serious. I think that's why Google's been such a driver of it, which is really, really awesome.
Yeah, I think you're all hitting on a lot of really good points. And I think a lot of performance and testing and a lot of these things needs to be tackled by changing the discussion. Because the reason why you're focusing on performance and the reason why you're focusing on testing and whatever else is because the end value that you're trying to provide, but the people you're trying to convince might not be able to connect those dots. So you need to change the discussion and talk about the end value and work backwards as to how these things benefit that outcome. And that the Lighthouse reminds me of a tool that I built years ago, Plato, which is just like a complexity analyzer for JavaScript, because the team kept on complaining about technical debt and complexity, and about how hard it was to make changes to the code base. And what I did was basically just built a tool that turned that complexity into bar charts that you could show the product team. And then once you had bars of different complexity, you could show how many features were being added to these modules that had lower complexity and how hard it was for these ones. And it became easier to talk about the outcome as opposed to just a team complaining about refactoring code. And I think that's why I keep on harping on user experience and starting way at the end with your users, because at the end of the day, if we're building an app that is meant to be used, that is the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter how you write it, what language it's in, how it's deployed, anything. If the user is delighted when they use it, then you've won. So starting there and working backwards enables us to talk as a team about these problems and how to tackle them. And that's why I keep on jumping back to the user experience.
I think I need that tool.
It blew up far more than I can handle it, and it's been mismanaged. So if you want to take on an open source project, it's looking for maintaining.
All right.
That's actually really good, right? Like this idea where, and I know Google thinks about this a lot, but this idea of what are the tools we actually need. I mean, Jarrod, this tool sounds pretty great, so I'd love to get a link for it, and that way we can actually put it in the show notes as well.
Oh, man.
No?
It's one of those open source guilt things that I try to forget about.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I mean, I love this podcast because, you know, we are going to be talking about exciting things like performance. I mean, one of the things that I have, and, you know, again, this is kind of like thinking about the developer that comes on board, right? A lot of times now we're kind of saying, you know, doing X, Y, Z, you know, is kind of like part of your development life cycle. Like, for example, checking your Lighthouse scores. That's part of that should be basically, that's what you do in general, right? But what are kind of some of the other things that maybe, you know, beginner/mid developers can do to make these easy wins, to just become better developers in general? Like, is there a list somewhere? Maybe we can come up with a list.
Specifically about performance or just in general?
Yeah, just about performance.
I mean, there's a lot of things that people say, like, are the things that you need to know, right? I mean, this is where, like, I'm just going to throw out some buzzwords and people can, if you're not familiar with them, you can maybe Google them. We'll probably talk about all of them at some point, but, you know, you'll hear things like the rail model or the purple pattern, the PRPL pattern, and things like that people use as sort of like these guideposts to help people get started in thinking about how to do performance. But I think, you know, one of the things is, you know, and I think a lot of people online that talk about features first, I think this is important. I think you got to ship a product, right? Like, you got to ship a product, you got to sell a product, because you got to keep the lights on, right? At a minimum, you got to do that. And so a lot of people, they can't maybe put the entire pattern into perspective right away. And I think that's why tools like Lighthouse are great. I think another tool that's underappreciated that we've talked about recently on the Modern Web podcast is WebHint. Another great tool which will look over your website and it'll find a lot of these things that are simple to do but might give you massive benefits, right? Like, one of them could be, if you're not gzipping your contents coming down from your server, well, in one fell swoop, right, a relatively straightforward configuration change, you could improve your performance like 90%. You know, I mean, like, massive things. So you don't have to feel like you need to be an expert Webpack person or an expert code splitter or an expert at these patterns. Use these tools, Lighthouse, WebHint, there's many others that give you a lot of like easy things that you can do to get massive gains right away. And then just do a couple of those a sprint and then see where you are. And then you can start learning the more complicated things and start talking to the business when things start taking multiple sprints, or you need to start having milestones about them, you know, then you're getting deeper. And at that point, that's awesome that you're having that much trouble squeezing performance out of your system. But there's a lot of easy stuff that people can just do with these tools. That's why they're there. That's why they're maintained, and they will walk you through the whole process.
Yeah, and Tracy, I think further to your point about sort of junior and mid-levels, it's really easy when you go and Google this stuff to sort of end up in this rabbit hole of the stuff Rob talked about, of like, are for loops faster than this, and the sort of really semantic stuff about performance that ultimately is good conversation, especially from a computer sciencey perspective. It's, you know, really useful. But if you're just trying to kind of get those big wins that Rob talks about, don't get overly focused on the tight semantics of the exact way that you build a for loop. Go look for the big wins. Go look for the stuff that has real value add to a team first, and have that group discussion about it, about those types of solutions, as opposed to getting stuck on the small stuff, because ultimately those might get you, you know, milliseconds or whatever. That's not going to have the bigger impact, I think, that most product owners and product managers are going to be expecting or looking for in a solution.
Yeah, it's always fun when I'm coding with my friends, you know, like Ben and Jay, let's say. And, you know, I'm always like, okay, am I doing it the right way? Am I doing it the right way? And I was like, well, maybe I wouldn't do it, whatever. And I'm always like, stop it. Teach me the best way to do it. Because, you know, otherwise when it sticks, it sticks, right? But I want to be taught the right way, the best way, the only way that it should be done. I mean, only way is kind of a stretch, but you guys get what I'm saying.
Yeah, there is no only in the web. It's it's what's good enough for the next 2 months.
1,000 ways to skin a cat.
You know, and I think this just made me think of something that, you know, I heard a talk from John Papa recently, and I think it's important that if you guys are listening, or, you know, if anybody's listening to this podcast and you are currently in your team having conversations about whether Vue is faster than React, or whether it's worth redoing your website because it's in Angular and you heard Angular was slow compared to, you know, Preact or something. I'm not going to say those conversations are worthless, but I think that those conversations might be at best a bit premature, and they might not be the questions you want to ask, because, you know, developer experience, how your team can be effective is still important. And I think what John Papa was saying in his talk was, as long as you're using one of the modern frameworks, or if you're not using a framework at all, I mean, nothing to say, you don't have to use a framework, but I know a lot of these conversations come up with the frameworks. If you're using one of the modern frameworks, you're probably fast enough for your team. If you get to the point where that's the thing that's slowing you down, if you can measure and that's the only thing you have left, have that conversation. But I think if the first thing your team is thinking about performance is whether to use React or Angular or Preact, you're probably putting the cart before the horse a little bit on that one. So, you know, it's probably not where I would personally recommend starting your performance journey. I mean, I don't know if anybody else has any feedback on that, but.
I'm an Angular guy through and through, and I've heard it all about slow and everything else. So, you know, I just say use what works for your team, what technical abilities everyone has, and try to make it the best you can. Ultimately, we're probably going to rewrite it in another couple of years anyway, and something else completely different. So, you know, from the Adobe Flex days where everyone hated our performance, we're here. So we've already come a long way.
Yeah, optimize for providing value as quickly as possible. And the frameworks like that, several years ago, it might have been a bigger problem, because if your framework is abandoned in 3 months, then you'd be left with a fair amount of technical debt. At this point in time, with Angular, React, Vue, Ember, they've been around for long enough. People have done great things with them. They're going to likely stick around for a lot longer. You're not going to go wrong with any of them. And the thing that's most important at the end of the day is the stuff that is unique to your application or your business or your use case. Focus on that and let the tools catch up.
Awesome. Well, I mean, this has been a great conversation. This certainly will not be the last conversation about performance we're going to have. This is going to be part of a larger series. We'll cover other topics as well, but we'll come back to performance and try to give even more in-depth tips, things that we experience and have encountered, you know, both as developers and as users of the web. So just to kind of round us out here, give everyone an opportunity to kind of give their last thoughts. And Tracy has asked, because at this dot, one of the most popular channels on our Slack is the cooking channel. We have some amazing cooks at this dot, so it is always popping off in that channel. So with your closing thoughts, the best thing that you've either eaten or cooked this week, it might be both. Tracy, why don't you get us started?
Okay, but also we have a parenting channel, which I think is super awesome. So Jarrod, hopefully this inspires you to create like some channel at Shape about parenting, because
oh yeah, we've already got one.
Oh, that's so great. Oh, I love it. So the best thing I ate today, or actually this week, was okay, so what I do is I take cheese and I melt it directly onto the pan, okay? And then once it starts getting a little bit brown and crispy, then I stick a tortilla on top. And then I let it melt a little bit more, and then I flip it over and just let the tortilla brown, and then I cut it into slices, and it's like so good because just, you know, crispy cheese. It's a better way to make a quesadilla.
Mm.
You're going to make it for your kids, right, Jarrod?
Yeah, actually, so this is not the best thing I've eaten this week, but you reminded me of cheese. And we love cheese at our house, and it took me years to figure out that a bag of sodium citrate is the best thing to have in the kitchen for kids and a family who like melted cheese. So if you ever like the nacho cheese or whatever else, but you don't like all the grossness that comes with it, adding some sodium citrate to a milk and then just adding cheese to it, you get the consistency of like the processed cheese, but it comes from exactly the cheese, whatever cheese you have on hand. So sharp cheddar, Colby, pepper jack, whatever else. You can make these very, very rich, creamy bases just by sprinkling a few grams of sodium citrate in the mixture. That's mine.
Great, James.
It's funny that you like cheese. My wife can attest. I'm a cheese fanatic. Pretty much as many times that I can add cheese extra, it's always going to be my first grab. In terms of probably the best thing, I made a spicy tri-tip that came out really, really nice, and I was super excited about. So I think I'm gonna have to make that one again this weekend. It's a nice cut of meat that I think a lot of people don't respect enough. And I had a friend of mine teach me how to cook it, and man, it comes out great when you get it right. It's great in tacos.
So mine's going to be something that I ate, not necessarily something that I cooked, because one of the things that I'm known for at this dot is being the guy that has Pop-Tarts for breakfast. So not exactly the greatest cook in the world, but the best thing that I ate was actually at Tracy's. She had hosted a potluck, and we brought some corny cornbread, which was delicious, and I've been eating it all week. But but her husband is just a meat master and puts so much care into the brisket and all the various types of meats that he produces. So I think I went to that event, and I think I just had a plate of meat, and I just went back for more meat. So that brisket is probably the best thing that I've eaten all week. That's for sure. But with that, I just want to thank everybody for coming out to this first episode of the This.Labs podcast. As I said, there'll be many more, with these hosts on various different topics. Thank you, everybody, for listening to Performance. Would really recommend. We'll put a lot of notes and links into the show notes. So anything that you heard about, you don't have to try and rewind back to find the links. We'll put some things down there and just play around with it. Point it at your sites just to see what pops out, and start those conversations. And if you have questions, feel free to hit us up. Want to thank my co-host, so Tracy Lee. You can find her on Twitter at Lady Leet, LadyLeet. Thank you, Jarrod. You can find him, Jarrod Overson. You can find him on Twitter at JS Overson. So that's JSOVERSON. And James, you can find him on Twitter at MySpivey. So MySpivey. I'm Rob Ocel. You can find me on Twitter at Rob Ocel with one extra L. So ROBOCELL. And thank you, everybody, so much. We'll catch you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.